And we were thinking like, once we had a mechanism by which you could have a well-intended plan and have someone who is capable of executing that plan, what if we were able to take, instead of having that athlete drive 2.5 hours, what if they had access to the programming and essentially the style that we do here, there? Welcome to Fitter Every Day, the show where we break fitness into bite-sized bits to help make you fitter every day. Well, with the start of the summer, we are in the main training cycle for most high school athletes. So we figured might as well bring our training expert as far as sports performance, so Director of Sports Performance, Tucker Herzberg. And so we're going to ask Tucker a little bit about how you set up programming. So Tucker, thanks for coming back in.
Thanks, Jeff.
I know how excited you are to talk about stuff.
Yeah,
anything.
I love being in front of athletes, but not in front of you and a mic.
Yeah. So the thing we want to start with these or with this is how do you set up a program? Because we've already, if you're interested in like where your background is, kind of how you got to this point, you did an episode with Sean maybe like 6 episodes ago. Go back and re-listen to that if you're not sure. So we're not going to do background. We're just going to dive into the topic. So when you're setting up programming, what are the goals that you set it up for, and then how do you work the things that you want into it specifically for sports performance?
So we try to be very specific with what each training day is going to encompass. So I think probably the biggest differentiator between maybe an average high school, small school strength program like you and I grew up with is instead of training specific movements or picking certain exercises for certain days, we're saying what's our main specific sport quality. So things like acceleration, top speed, vertical jump, lateral agility, making that our goal for the day. And then from there, picking movements and exercises to fit in there instead of saying, okay, today's our bench day, today's our squat day, today's our clean day. That's probably the biggest way we try to differentiate and how we structure our summer is for our athletes that need speed, acceleration, and top speed days. For our volleyball, basketball players who need more vertical jump, lateral agility, making those the main focuses of their day. And then some athletes who are just in the off season and just need to get stronger, that's their main focus. So that'd be a pretty easy way to break it down for how we structure things.
So when you're comparing that methodology, so essentially starting with the outcome in mind as opposed to the process, which both of them have their place. Like, so when I was doing most of the athletics, and I'm in my 30s now, so like, what's weird about this field of just general like sports performance is it actually moves really fast. Like when you compare now to 10 years ago, to 10 years before that, to 10 years before that, the differences that people find effective are really, really different. And so you kind of have to adapt and evolve with that. But so back in my day, officially in my day is a thing that I can say is a decade ago, it's very much upper body push, upper body pull, lower body push, lower body pull. That's what you're doing in the day. And then kind of you hang some accessory stuff around that because you are trying to build overall well-rounded strength. But what I think that lacks, if it lacks anything, is you then become pretty strong everywhere. But depending on what you include or don't include as far as like sprinting, jumping, changing direction, unilateral stuff, so one leg at a time, one arm at a time, you lose some adaptability and some kind of the translatability of that. So you're mentioning that like you start with the outcome in mind on speed days. So like what is a speed day kind of focus for that rather than I'm squatting and I'm doing some jumps after I squat? Like what does that look like?
Yeah, so for example, an acceleration day, we know early acceleration, which is anywhere from 10 to 20 yards, requires a little bit more max strength, max force production than maybe say top speed where you need a lot of force, but you need to do it very quickly. So on our acceleration days, that's our heavy lifting days. So after we do our acceleration work, whether that's short sprints, sled sprints, things with resisted movements while you're running, that we'll add our heavy lifts in. So we'll do our traditional back squat. We'll do heavy lunges, we'll do trap bar deadlifts, heavy split squats, things that are more for max strength. And then on the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, on our top speed days, we're doing our flying sprints, our 30-yard dash, 40-yard dash, things that get athletes to top speed. And then our lifts would be more of our speed strength lifts. So instead of going heavy and slow, grinding through lifts like we might do on our acceleration days, we're doing hang clean, power clean, snatches, maybe a back squat with lighter weight, moving more for speed, maybe a squat jump. things that produce a lot of force, but with more of a speed emphasis rather than, again, just grinding it out on our other max strength days.
So does that then? So you mentioned like the acceleration and the top speed days. Jump days, are those have to have a slightly different focus, especially because when you have players like a volleyball players, if it's only a volleyball player. Now, granted, when you're talking about high schoolers, most high schoolers play more than one sport or do more than one activity. Like, at least in Iowa where we're at, it's very, very common to be multi-sport. It's much more rare to just be a basketball player or just be a baseball player. It happens, but it's much less rare. So assuming that we are talking about like just a volleyball player, they very rarely are going to be at like top speed sprinting. The court's, 40 feet wide? So like, it's not like there's a huge amount of space for them to run, but they do have to jump. So how do you take that into effect on like programming and planning and working in like the vertical jumping days with layering weights and stuff on top of that too?
Yep. So I guess going back a little bit. So with our acceleration and top speed days, we'll also program certain jumps on those days based on what our sprinting goal is. So this is, again, more for our track athletes, football, soccer athletes that do need more sprinting work than maybe basketball or volleyball. So on our acceleration days, along with our heavy lifts, we'll do jumps that, again, produce a little bit more force and power, but might be a little bit slower. So things like a standing vertical jump, dumbbell jumps, a single leg jump where you're not doing any kind of approach to it. So jumps that produce a lot of power, but they might be a little bit slower, are okay on acceleration days. Then our top speed days will do more of our plyometric days. So pogo jumps, bounding, leaping, things like that are explosive but very fast as well. So that's how we program on our speed days. Now for athletes like volleyball, basketball, we usually just replace top speed days with lateral agility jump days. So we'll break those into categories. So an approach vertical jump day would be one example. Jumps to work on that are obviously things where you're building momentum into a jump versus maybe a jump where you're going laterally to work on getting to a ball or cutting someone off on defense where you're doing maybe a lateral bound, a lateral box jump, a lateral skater jump, things like that.
I would imagine that's also true for sports like baseball and softball because lateral quickness is much more important than straight line top speed, especially in softball where the field's a little bit more condensed. An outfielder and every hitter needs to be able to sprint. But more specifically, a second baseman is going laterally side to side. So I imagine your kind of baseball player-y body types tends to fall in that too.
Yep, yeah, that I guess baseball, softball would fall in there. Now, one caveat I will say, we try for almost all of our athletes to do at least a tiny bit of top speed work. Sprinting full speed, usually most athletes, 20 to 30 yards or more is how long it takes you to get to your top speed. If you do that at least once a week, just from a general health perspective, it's one of the best ways to strengthen your hamstring is to sprint at top speed. If you can sprint at top speed, max effort with no issues on hamstrings or ankles or anything like that, when you're never reaching top speed, you're pretty much prepared for any speed you're going to run at. So we do try to do some top speed with all athletes, but certainly more with our track athletes compared to softball, baseball, volleyball, basketball.
How would you say that this style, and we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, differs from what schools do? So like the reason why I asked this question, not a lot of times, every kid that we have goes to some type of school, homeschool, public school, private school. They go to some type of school. And most of those schools have a program where they are lifting and working out at the school. How do you balance not overdoing it or working with that? So kind of the two-part question. So I'll stop at part one. How do you integrate and make sure kids don't overdo what they're doing at school with what they're doing in our facility to make sure they're not meshing poorly?
Number one is communication. All our athletes start off with an assessment where we take them through baseline testing on sprints, jumps, some body weight strength movements. We figure out what other training that they're doing. So I'd say probably half of our athletes in our program lift at school. The other half don't lift at school. They just lift with us. So our athletes who lift at school, when they're with us, all we're doing is speed, agility, body weight strength movements, and a lot of mobility, which they might not be doing at school just because they don't have as much time. They're usually doing 45-minute lifts with their team, and there's 80 kids in the session, so they don't have a ton of time for maybe extra stretching at the end. So those athletes, we really don't do any heavy lifting with. It's all accessory lifts along with our speed, agility, mobility. Our athletes who do not lift at school, then it's a pretty typical, comprehensive program. So some sprinting, some agility, and then some strength work to finish the session. So we talk with them. We know what they're doing, and then we just basically fill in all the gaps for what they're not doing at school.
So then what would you say when you interact most, now granted this is a little bit different, what would you say the ones that are lifting at school, when you find, I don't want to say necessarily a deficiency, but like what are the things that the athletes, when they come to our facility or when they do a program, not necessarily even like, I don't want to say like it's just ours, it's just that's the frame of reference that we have. So someone doing a speed and agility program anywhere, what are the things what things do those athletes improve upon the most and the fastest when they do get a speed program layered in with what the school is actually doing?
So I guess for lifting standpoint, again, most times at school, again, I know a lot of great high school strength coaches they're covering the bases on their heavy lifts, a lot of 2-leg stuff. So when they're with us, it's usually single leg training. If they don't do a ton of that at school, it's usually body weight lifts, pistol squats, skater squats, Nordic hamstrings, things that are very challenging for high school athletes, but aren't going to overload them from a maximal weight perspective because they're already covering that at school. But I guess on the other hand, most of our athletes that lift at school don't do a ton of speed training, or it's, as in was my experience, our speed day is a couple speed stations where we're eventually turning into a conditioning session because we're not giving them proper rest between sets. We're doing so many different drills and trying to rotate so many athletes through that we just don't have time to, maybe bring out the timing gates and time everybody that day, or there's just not enough coaches to be able to, again, work with, I guess, smaller groups. So again, it's a big group, it's stations, it's conditioning. So when they're in our program, we take time to rest between sprints. We time all of our sprints. We track that. So over time, we know where their baseline was, what their improvements are. We use, I guess, what's called the feed the cats approach, which we didn't come up with, but it's you rank your athletes based on how fast they are. You publish the results and the competition that creates between athletes. In our program, we have probably served 10 different schools in the area. So kids, when they come in, they see leaderboards with who's ran the fastest on the sprint. That's what we're timing that day. So the competition that creates, I would say, along with just the good speed work we're providing with max effort sprinting, technique work, providing rest between sprints so they can do multiple reps at max effort. I guess that's why they're getting faster, because we're able to add those things in with maybe what they're not doing at school if they're not doing a speed program at school.
Another thing you're talking about is just the competitive aspect. One thing that we just started doing in the last year or so is trying to get more kids, I don't want to say like on that leaderboard necessarily. It's not like the main purpose, but the more access we have to take that to people, the more that competition sort of stacks on itself. And then also trying to like serve as many athletes as we can. One of the things we started doing in the last year is actually taking the program that we have and getting it to the schools. We've tested this with at least a little bit. Describe a little bit about the interactions and stuff that you've seen working with those schools of taking our programming and putting it in schools and what they've sort of experienced.
It's as simple as adding just a high quality speed program before they do their strength work. So most schools, I find, unless they're, way far back still doing, more like just powerlifting only or bodybuilding type training, most schools have a pretty good strength program in place. So literally adding a 30-minute speed session before they lift has been a game changer for a couple of the schools we worked with. So we teach them how to use our timing gates that we provide them with. We time sprints every session that we're doing speed work. So again, athletes are running max effort. We know they are because we're timing it. They're tracking that over time. We teach them how much rest to take between sprints. So it's not sprint 40 yards, walk back and go again. We give them the proper rest to sprint guidelines. And just doing that 2-3 days a week throughout the summer, in addition with their lifting program they already have in place, has been very effective for the schools that we tested with last summer, which is pretty much what our program looks like in Ankeny and Huxley and Nevada. But just that they can do on their own with their school. Yeah, and so where this idea came from to think that we could do it. So Tucker's really smart. Like, I'm going to talk directly down camera. Tucker's really smart. And one of the things that when we were talking about is like, there was a time, and this was when it was just Sean running everything. There was a time back when we had an athlete who would drive 2.5 hours from where she lived to our training facility
3 times a week and would come down specifically to do speed work and then drive back. And literally, I mean, it's 5 hours in a car, 3 days a week just to get speed work. And she ended up winning 4 state championships in track and field. I mean, incredible athlete, terrific person too, but like incredible athlete. And we were thinking like, once we had a mechanism by which you could have a well-intended plan and have someone who is capable of executing that plan, what if we were able to take, instead of having that athlete drive 2.5 hours, what if they had access to the programming and essentially the style that we do here there? Then it's not trying to say everyone needs to come do our thing. But if the results that she's getting could have been done at least reasonably as effectively as we can do it here, why don't we try and do that? And so that's when we started reaching out to schools to see if we would be able to take what we do in the gym and add them to other places. So that program, it's been tested now for about, 15 months, I think, ish, about taking it inside of schools. And that program, we're calling it Goldfinch Speed. So like we wanted to introduce that with a little bit of context as to taking what we do inside of the gym and letting people know like this thing is available to be able to be brought to schools. So when you're thinking about doing that in a school, a natural reticence would be, we're already doing a strength program, or we already have this thing. Why is yours different, or why is yours better? And I think there's a couple answers to that for me, and then I'll kind of turn one over to you. Is if you already have a strength, like the school that I come from, Southeast Polk, I mean, they just won a football state championship. They win like every other state championship. They have one of the best strength and conditioning programs, and there's a reason why they have some of the highest recruits in pretty much every sport. They're really good at it, but they also have the resources and means to do that. There are schools, especially when you get outside of the metropolitan areas, that just don't have the resource to do it. You have a football coach who's also happens to be the track coach, who also happens to be a PE teacher, who also happens to be like, he drives the van because there's only 7 kids that are on the track team that are going there, and they do all those things. Well, that school, those kids still could have access to the same thing that we do. So it's not necessarily saying that like it's better than everything that you're doing, because it might not be. But to have access to speed programming, that's where I think the line can be. So for smaller schools that like you grew up going to a smaller school, what do you see as necessarily the difference between what small school programs do versus what can be done if you integrate just a little bit more speed programming into that?
It's like you said, it's mainly strength work. It's mainly strength days based on a specific movement, whether it's bench, squat, or clean. It's not a specific goal necessarily higher than that. It's just max strength. We're picking an exercise, and that's what we're going to do for that day. There's maybe some variations. Instead of barbell bench press, you do dumbbell bench press, but it's pretty simple from a strength standpoint. Can be effective. I guess one other thing that I've seen some schools continue to do is just train their high schoolers like bodybuilders. So maybe on their upper body days, they're doing 3 to 4 different upper body exercises that are all pushing, and no chin-ups, no rows, nothing for, posterior chain. So that's just, I guess, a small mistake that small schools can make. Again, just if you don't have the resources for a comprehensive strength program. But the main thing is for their speed training, it always gets turned into conditioning. So if we're sprinting, again, like I mentioned earlier, instead of resting between sprints with the proper, guidelines for speed training, you sprint, you jog back, you sprint again. So by the second rep, you're already fatigued, and none of your reps after your first rep are 100%. And if you're sprinting for speed, you've got to be running 95% or faster of your max speed to really get any adaptation and to get faster. So if your first rep is full speed and no other reps are, you got one good rep for the day, you really can't get faster doing that. So teaching coaches how much sprinting to do, how much rest to take, how to time their sprints, what systems we recommend, how to track that stuff. We do fun things like give out speed bands for athletes who run 15 miles per hour or higher. So every level they reach, we give out speed bands, and we provide those with our schools that we work with, which is just a really fun way to teach athletes that speed is our main training goal. We're going to reward you for that. We're going to create competition around that. So that's really the most simple way to explain how we kind of attack that with small schools.
This is that you're mentioning the speed as the main focus, which I think, for lack of a better way of describing it, that's where when I say like, if you go back 10 years and go back 10 years, that this field moves and changes a lot, that the focus towards speed and explosiveness away from mass, that is kind of the driver of where the strength and conditioning field is turning. And the example, I think, is a really easy example for us that are in the state of Iowa. The most recent first-round pick, the first-round pick from Iowa State 50 years, was Will McDonald. Well, Will McDonald is a 6'5", I think, 6'4", 6'5", 235-ish, 240-pound defensive end. He is incredibly fast. And the reason why he was picked so high is because of that speed. If you were to put Will McDonald in a weight room in 1995, they wouldn't have felt that was as much of a strength, and they would have tried to forcibly add 20 pounds of muscle or 25 pounds of muscle on, because mass was seen as the most important attribute of an athlete, because mass moves mass. You can, if you're a bigger, stronger guy or bigger, stronger athlete, then you can thereby just execute better. But now they're athletes like Will McDonald, or like a guy like, I don't know, Sauce Gardner, who's a corner in the NFL. The guys like that, Justin Jefferson, you're a big Vikings fan. Justin Jefferson's not a big guy, but he is fast, and that's where the success, and granted, that's football. Those are the easiest ones to come to mind because that's the sport that I'm closest to. But that's where the strength and conditioning field is kind of sorting to. And so instead of incentivizing, we have a squat, bench, clean, deadlift leaderboard, which all those things are very important. Incentivizing overall speed, those things, squat, bench, dead, whatever, those then become mechanisms to grow that speed as opposed to ends in and of themselves. So I think that's the big thing that's the reason why it's important, is translating speed and making sure that it's not just, all right, I'm going to be really strong and therefore I will be really fast.
Yeah, I guess two things come to mind when you say that. One, I think strength training it's much easier, even as a coach, for my own profession, it's much easier to get someone to an insane level of strength than speed, because, genetics just have such a higher role with speed than strength. Anybody can get really strong. Obviously, there's a limit to that, but someone's speed limitation is much more based on their genetics than what their strength limitation would be. So I guess that's one area where maybe coaches, you feel like, I have an athlete who's just not very genetically gifted. There's only, we could get faster, but it's not going to be the same as this kid who is just naturally fast. So I'm just going to get him strong and try to make that his competing factor, because he's just not going to be very fast. So I can see why coaches have always and still continue to gear a little bit more towards strength, because that can level the playing field just from a strength standpoint only, regardless of your genetics. But then the second thing would be, if you can get someone faster and stronger at the same time. If you're getting someone stronger, they might not be getting faster. They honestly might be getting slower. Like you mentioned, if they're getting stronger, but they're adding too much body weight, too much mass, where their speed can't keep up with that. So that's the main reason, I think, to make speed the priority is, again, you can get faster and stronger at the same time. If you get stronger, you might not be getting faster. So I'd rather take maybe a little bit less strength, but for sure, I guess guarantee I'm getting faster than going the other way and hoping I get faster and knowing I get stronger. So I guess that's a trade-off you kind of have to pick between.
Yeah, and I think, just to kind of wrap this up, I don't think this is it's not meant to say that conventional strength and conditioning or conventional strength work is bad.
No,
by
not at all.
No means is that the case. And so if you're in the comments section, just like play the video a little further by the time you get here. By no means is that bad. And I mean,
it's incredible, like staying healthy, injury risk, like it's a huge factor.
And especially depending upon the position you play. Like If you are an offensive guard, you still need to be explosive, but you got to be strong. Like point blank, plain and simple, you got to move another human being out of the way. If you are a catcher, you have to be strong and flexible enough to hold a squat position for 2 hours. Like that is still very, very important. But I think the idea that we can incorporate speed a little more intentionally makes the strength conditioning and let me pause it. One of the things is the term strength conditioning is missing a word. So like strength, speed, and conditioning, that together is sort of where I think the future is sort of trying to go. And that's one of the things we want to try and bring as much as we can to people, no matter where they're at. So if you are interested in, or know somebody who's interested in at least learning a little bit more, goldfinchspeed.com is where we have all of the be able to take our speed program and integrate it with schools, teams, whether it's a high school, whether it's a club baseball, volleyball, soccer team. They can work because individual athletes, or if there's a facility that wants to, like a CrossFit gym or another gym that's looking to get the speed program kind of built into what they already do, goldfinchspeed.com is where we've got information on it. So thanks, Tucker, for coming in and kind of shedding a little bit of wisdom, and appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to Fitter Every Day. For more information on our programs, locations, or any of the content that we have to offer, go to www.goldfinchathletics.com. And if you want us delivered directly to your mailbox, go to the newsletter tab while you're at the website. For any information or links mentioned in this episode, check the show notes. We'll check you next episode.